And thank you again for joining us. I am going to turn it over to Larry and to Al, who are our co-coordinators for the Florida chapter of World Beyond War, which is hosting today's event. So take it away, Larry and Al.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to present this webinar this evening entitled The Political, Media, and Operational Lessons Learned from the Afghan and Iraq Wars by the U.S. military. And presenting this evening is Matthew Ho, who is an emeritus senior fellow with the Center for International Policy and a member of the Eisenhower Media Network. He is a 100% disabled Marine combat veteran, and in 2009, he resigned his position with the State Department in Afghanistan in protest of the escalation of the war. Matthew is a member of the advisory board for our World Beyond War. Also, I'd like to just turn it over to Al Mitty, our co-coordinator, and then this will be followed by Matthew Ho, our presenter this evening. An excellent presenter, by the way.
Yeah, thank you, Larry, and Matthew, thank you very much for agreeing to present to this group tonight. We appreciate your experience, your knowledge, and your passion, and all that you bring to the world of advocates for peace and abolition of war. I also want to thank Mark and Greta for their ongoing support and their help with the technical things and everything that they do for World Beyond War, because they make World Beyond War a great organization. I put in the chat that I was formerly in the Villages, Florida. I've recently moved to Illinois, where I'm hoping we can get some folks in Illinois to come together, advocates for peace and the abolition of war, to perhaps consider starting a chapter of World Beyond War in Illinois. So that's my intro, and it's just a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone for joining.
Take it away, Matt.
Okay, thank you so much. I really appreciate this opportunity. Thanks, Greta, Larry, Al, Mark, for doing this. Everyone at World Beyond War and Veterans for Peace who is involved, and then thanks everyone for joining. Happy holidays to everyone. Before I begin, I do want to make a plug for a relatively new organization action that is occurring. The Merchants of Death War Tribunal. If you go to merchantsofdeath.org, you can find more information on it. This is a tribunal, a people's tribunal that has already served subpoenas to 4 of the largest merchants of death, war contractors, weapons companies, Raytheon, Lockheed, Northrop, and I think General Atomics. Were the 4 that were served. And so this will be a legal proceeding, and it will, I think it will be very important and invaluable as we go forward in this community, what this tribunal produces over the next year. And so if you could please go to merchantsofdeath.org and support, get involved, however you can in whatever way possible. I think it'd be a worthy thing to be a part of. Again, thank you all for having me here. I am not usually a person who uses PowerPoints, but tonight I'm going to use one just because I think some of the material I have, whether it's some of the screenshots of headlines in the newspapers from 15 years ago, or just graphs and data, is important for people to see. And then hopefully won't ramble on too long and have some time for Q&A. I'll open up the PowerPoint now. And, I don't think anything I'm saying here is going to be new to anyone. And I don't think anyone is going to be surprised by what I'm saying in terms of how the empire, if you will, evolved, how we went from having a war-making machine that was embracing and desperately seeking media coverage of the wars. They wanted these to be the most public and high profile and viewed wars possible. If you go back 20 years ago, that's certainly what the Bush White House and the Rumsfeld Pentagon wanted, to now where we have a number of secret wars, possibly numbering more than 15, that span from the west coast of Africa all the way through Pakistan and even beyond, because we have operations that occur in places like the Philippines or in Indonesia. So how did this occur? How did this evolve? And what does that mean for us in the anti-war community? And also, too, I want to kind of address this kind of attitude I feel that a lot of people have, not so much in our community, but outside of it, that the anti-war community really didn't do anything, that the anti-war community really didn't have an impact over the last 20 years. And I think that's completely wrong. Unfortunately, the impact that the anti-war community had wasn't the impact it wanted, but it certainly did put such tremendous pressure on successive White Houses and the Pentagon that they had to change their entire war fighting methods, manner, apparatus, and again, go from having what they wanted to be as publicly viewed and highly immersive wars with journalists embedded and everything else to being just a collection of secret wars. So let me put this on full screen. I'm not sure why that's not working. Okay, there we go. Can everyone see that okay? Okay, so
yeah, it's not on full screen though.
It's not on full screen.
If you go to slideshow and then from beginning, maybe.
Yeah, go to the slideshow tab.
Right there, over no.
I can't see it because
there you go.
Yeah,
and then
okay.
Play from start.
Play from start. Okay, great. Thank you. That Zoom bar is in the way, so I'll blame it on that. Okay, so I titled this. I cut it back. The title I gave Larry last week was obnoxiously very long, so I cut it back. It's just call this "The Empire's Lessons Learned." All right, how the White House and Pentagon learned from and evolved from catastrophe and failure in the U.S. wars in the Muslim world. Okay, so I kind of look at this and I feel that there are three key takeaways from the U.S. government, the Pentagon's war on terror. And when I say Pentagon, I include the entire war-making apparatus. So I'm including the CIA, I'm including the State Department, I'm including the NSC, that whole war-making machine, that Leviathan. I include all of that in there. So what I see are the three takeaways over the last 20 years that they would have are on the political side, that the wars proved to be unpopular and politically costly. On the media side, that the initial investment and control in the media that the United States government and Pentagon bet on became very problematic, and it led to very real political losses and decline in support for the U.S. military. We've seen over the last 20 years, right? The U.S. military, it's still one of the most trusted institutions in the country, or the most trusted institution in the country, but it's certainly its a level of trustworthiness has taken a deep dive over the years, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years, as we've seen. But also, too, we've seen how that plays out in reality, where you have a case like the Army this year missing its recruiting goal by a factor of 25%. They were like 15,000 people short of their recruiting goal. Okay, so that has a very real effect on them. And then operationally, I think they look back and they say, these wars in the Muslim world, they were burdensome, they were exhausting, and they weren't the wars that we wanted. This was not the wars that we wanted to fight. And we'll get into that a little bit about how there are some outliers with that. But that's basically the three takeaways I look if I'm putting on my empire hat and saying, how would I view these last 20 years? So on the political side, let's go back 20 years, basically. And I think looking at the political aspects of war, what they were expecting, what they were hoping for, I think best can be taken from Karl Rove and looking at him as an example. And I'm going to try and go through this as quickly as possible because I can get bogged down, and I'll be happy to share these slides with anyone and go into more details later. But I kind of want to get through this to get to the meat of it and then have a discussion with you all. But starting with Rove, we go back and we look what he says in January of 2002, where he says, people trust the Republican Party to do a better job of protecting Americans. And that's true. That's what the polling data showed. The polling data showed that Republicans had a huge lead over the Democrats when it came to issues of national security, defense, being tough on terror, etc. And then in '02, in the summer of '02, Rove puts out a planning document, a strategy document for the GOP about the 2002 midterms. And it says focus on war. And then, as we know, what the Republicans do, what the White House does, is they introduce the Iraq War resolution before the midterms. And Rove is a huge player in that. And this forces all the likely Democratic candidates for president in 2004, at least the ones who are in the Senate. So you're talking about John Kerry, John Edwards, Hillary Clinton. I think Chris Dodd was a big player then. To have to sign up for this war. And notably, as we know, Barack Obama was not in the Senate then. Okay, and that of course will become a major factor 6 years later. And then even after the war begins, you see journalist accounts of how Rove is conducting himself, how the White House is conducting himself, how they relate themselves to the war. And so you'd see things like, a couple of weeks after the war has started, where the New York Times is saying things, as I quote here, Mr. Bush as a wartime leader and to prepare for the re-election campaign that will start as soon as the war ends, right? So there's no ambiguity here. There is a confidence that this is going to go a certain way, and this is going to secure a 2004 electoral win for the White House. And of course, they were successful. The 2002 midterm results saw the Republicans take the Senate, and they held on to the House. And they just hold on to the House. They gained seats there as well, and they had a very war-focused campaign. Now, of course, it's important to remember that at that point, Iraq had not been invaded. Americans were not dying there yet, and very little was happening in Afghanistan. So what we see, I just want to kind of go through the public opinion because I think it's good to refresh ourselves. And I think this first public opinion poll that I selected, I think this has a good point to it. So this is from January 2003, a Times CNN. And if you look, you'll see that it talks about whether or not the United States is morally justified in sending troops to Iraq and removing Saddam Hussein from power. And 2/3 of Americans say that we are morally justified. And I want you to hang on to that thought, that use, particularly of that moral justification, because I think that's going to factor into how administrations, how the media, and how the American public come to understand these wars later. But 2/3 of Americans in January 2003 saying going into Iraq, invading it, taking Saddam from power, occupying it, that's a morally justifiable action. All right, we see a couple days before the invasion, support for the war, 71%. About a month after the invasion, support for the war, 78%. In the summer, 3 months after the invasion, 53% of Americans, when asked how they feel about the war, say they are more supportive of the war now than they were 3 months ago when the war started. So even a few months into the war, people are still are not just supportive, but the war itself is gaining support. And then even you see by October of '03, when casualties have certainly increased, it's clear that there's an insurgency beginning. Things are not going as well. The Pentagon is having to send more troops to Iraq. Big stories back then were about stop loss, how soldiers were getting kept in the military because the U.S. didn't have enough troops to fight in Iraq. So a lot of things like that are percolating in the media. But even with that, you still see more Americans than not approving of the current occupation of Iraq. Okay, and then here, of course, this is from Pew, and this shows the timeline of support for the war in Iraq. I think it's important to note how Pew phrases this. They phrase it as decision to use military force. So this is always a backward-looking question in the sense of they're asking Americans, was it the right decision a month ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, et cetera, to go into Iraq? But certainly you can see how the trend line clearly was established, particularly by the beginning of 2004, and how that just went as it did. And that, of course, once it crosses that mark somewhere in 2006, 2007, the war never recovers, even with the, quote, success, unquote, of the surge, the celebrity of General Petraeus, on and on and on. Okay, so let's get into the first election, the 2004 election. And what we see here is some really interesting stuff from the exit polls about how people viewed the war. Particularly 7 in 10 voters went to the polls saying, I'm worried that there's going to be another major terror attack. Again, 9/11 was just 3 years prior. Bush gets 53% of those voters, right? So he gets a fear-based vote. And then 55% of voters consider the war in Iraq to be a part of the war on terror. So what's going to keep us safe from another 9/11? The war in Iraq. And Bush gets 4 out of 5 of those voters. And then what we see here, kind of as I referenced before, what Rove had said about how Republicans have an edge on Democrats being tougher on terror, stronger on defense, et cetera. Well, you see that translates into an 18-point advantage over Kerry on that question in the 2004 election. And, why was for me, I kind of looked at this and I said, well, what happened in 2004? How come the war was clearly a failure? People were turning against it at that point. But I look at it and I say, it's still early in the war. And more Americans were still supporting Iraq than not supporting. The numbers were up and down, but that's kind of where you're at. And then what you had, too, you had a very smartly done political military campaign in Iraq in 2004 that I think the Pentagon and the White House were able to do once in the Bush administration and once in the Obama administration. This idea of fool me once, shame on me, or shame on you, fool me twice. And when they were able to do that, what they did in 2004 was they began an offensive in October. We had major combat operations occurring in cities like Samarra, Najaf, and Baghdad. And you also had General Petraeus, if people remember, in the literally days before the election, he's writing an op-ed urging Americans to stay the course. And this is something that, in retrospect, I don't think gets enough attention. The fact that the soon-to-be commander of American forces in Iraq is writing an op-ed, and I can't remember if it was the New York Times or the Washington Post, urging Americans to re-elect Bush in order to win the war in Iraq. That's essentially what's occurring. And it really is something I don't think has been reflected upon enough, that crossover, that intertwine, or that collaboration between a 4-star general and the White House. And of course, what Petraeus was teasing was the Fallujah campaign, the Battle of Fallujah, the biggest battle of the Iraq War, which begins a week after the midterm elections. And that brings upon this whole idea of a new strategy. And I think most importantly in 2004, the Dems weren't unified on their anti-war message. They hadn't chosen to really campaign on it hard. There was a lot of splits in their caucus about it. I think this is, people will remember, Kerry was criticized because he said something along like, I was for it before I was against it. And, he gets hit with the flip-flopping label. And so I think those were the factors that kind of led into Bush being able to get through 2004, even though the Iraq War was being viewed more and more unfavorably, and rightly so. So we get to the 2006 elections, and now we see something that has really, and we'll get into this a bit later on about the media. But at this point, when we go into the midterms, the 2006 elections, the Iraq War and the GOP corruption dominate voters' concerns. With the GOP corruption, if people remember Jack Abramoff and all those scandals that were occurring, if you don't know about that, look it up. It really is. I was amazed looking back at it again at how brazen a lot of that was. But it was. Those two things dominated voters' concerns. And the Democrats prioritized the Iraq War in their messaging, and they ended up taking both the House and the Senate. They forced Donald Rumsfeld to resign, and the Bush White House really spends the next couple of years with its tail between its legs. And when you look at the exit polling, you see that 57% of voters in that election disapproved of the Iraq War. And that 18-point difference we were talking about in 2004, where Republicans had that edge on being tougher than Democrats, well, that dropped to a 2-point edge in 2006. So you saw how quickly the public's perception of the parties shifted. And I've got here on this slide just a couple of news stories. CBS, Iraq War was voted top story of 2006, and then the New York Times, Democrats turned war into an ally. So it's well understood, and I just wanted to put on here a couple of studies, because both from a journalistic perspective and an academic perspective, very clear that the Iraq War or the 2006 midterm elections were about the Iraq War. And here's a couple examples of some studies that you can look up, get some more information on that. Some more details on actually how did that actually play out, in terms of the demographics, voting, turnout, et cetera. And here's a couple of good studies for that. And then we get to the 2008 elections, and Obama runs as an anti-war candidate. And I know at least half of you all just sighed and rolled your eyes and punched the table or whatever, because he was anything but an anti-war president. But he runs as an anti-war candidate. And here on the screen, I have a couple of again, other headlines showing how he was promoted that way. From the Times, as candidate, Obama carves anti-war stance. From NPR, Obama still stumps on 2002 anti-war declaration. Now, remember, he wasn't in the Senate when the Iraq War resolution came through, so he was removed from that. So he was really able to set himself apart. And then when we see in the actual elections, we see 63% of voters disapproved of the Iraq War. And of those voters who said the Iraq War was their top issue, Obama got 59% of them, so almost 2/3. And on this next slide, I just have a couple of quotes from Obama during that campaign. He runs, in the Democratic primary debate, he used his anti-war credentials. And if people could see me, they would see I'm doing air quotes right now. But what he says in his primary debate, he says, I offer a clear contrast as somebody who never supported this war. And then in the summer, in the general election, he, directly takes on John McCain on this war. I oppose going to war in Iraq. Senator McCain was one of Washington's biggest supporters for the war. Now, as we know, Obama moderated his position. And in the summer, the fall of 2008, his position on Iraq becomes, I'm going to follow Bush's plan to get out, and I'm going to escalate the war in Afghanistan and win. And he starts playing up this trope of Afghanistan being the good war, the war that we should have always been in, not the stupid war that Bush and the Republicans led us into. So he's very smart about how he's messaging. It's horrendous for millions of people, but he's very smart about how he messages. So here's a couple other studies about the 2008 war, if people want to look these up. And like I said, I'm happy to share this presentation, and in the presentation notes, there's links to all these things. But, so this idea about how much the Iraq war impacted the fortunes of 2006 and 2008, it doesn't just impact the Democrats and Republicans, but within the Democratic Party, it has a huge impact. I mean, you go back and you look at this, and it's clear that, from the writing at the time, and if you look at some of these studies, that Obama beats Clinton because of the Iraq War, right? So this idea that somehow the wars weren't going to have effect on politics, how it's going to be business as usual, I think a lot of those assertions were just, frankly, evidence-less and baseless, but we still, I feel, hear them to this day. And not in our community, I know, but I feel outside of community, particularly within DC, I feel for some reason there's this reluctance to accept these basic truths. And then we get into what will be the counterclaim about, well, how the wars didn't affect it. And this is where we start to see how the Obama administration and its Pentagon really learns from the lessons of the last 6, 7, 8 years. Okay, but in the 2010, 2012 elections, the wars don't really play a role. One, we've got the Great Recession. 10 million people are losing their homes. Unemployment is the highest it's been in 70 some odd years, 80 years. So, you have that occurring, and that dominates people's concerns. Obama also ends the Iraq War. By the end of 2011, all American combat troops are out of Iraq, and the violence in Iraq had dropped substantially. Osama bin Laden is killed in 2011, and the United States begins its drawdown from Afghanistan in 2011. So what Barack Obama does is he comes in, he says, I'm going to win this war. So he puffs his chest out, he gets all tough, he puts a 250,000 man army in Afghanistan, because if you remember how big that escalation was, when Obama comes into office, there's about 32,000 American troops in Afghanistan, about 15,000 NATO troops in Afghanistan, and about an equivalent number of contractors. And within a year and a half, there's 100,000 American troops, 40,000 NATO troops, and about 100,000 contractors, so about a 250,000 man army there in Afghanistan. But he starts pulling them out in 2011 and talking about how the war is going to be turned over to the Afghans by the end of 2012, and by 2014 there will not be a U.S. combat presence in Afghanistan. So he's very skilled in his narrative. So people say, well, this is maybe not something we have to worry about, or I'm not concerned. He's ending the war. So we also see that again with the economy and all other things. In 2010, only 3% of voters say Afghanistan is their top issue. And then in 2012, the exit polls say that only 5% say foreign policy is their biggest concern. So I'm not even sure where the wars fit into that, because people could be talking about trade issues with China or something. I don't know. And then, the big thing too in 2012 is that Romney and Obama were basically indistinguishable in terms of what they were proposing for Afghanistan. And here's just a couple of headlines from 2010 and then from 2012. And in 2016, I think is the one that surprises people in terms of the effect of the Iraq War. And it wasn't, as I think a lot of us would like to have seen, had it been an effect, because the United States was in the process then, the United States Air Force and Navy were in the process in 2016 of destroying every city in eastern Syria and in western Iraq and northern Iraq. But it's got to do with the initial war, the American invasion and occupation. And you can see here in his headline from the Wall Street Journal in 2015, Iraq war persists as awkward election issue. And so just as Obama did in 2008, where he was able to separate himself from his Democratic rivals by saying, I didn't vote for the Iraq war. I wasn't on board with that. That was a dumb war. Well, that's what Donald Trump does as well. And he's able to separate himself from his rivals. And then I think here's the thing that surprises most people. And so what you have is in 2017, you have a study come out. In this study, and it's a very good study, and I encourage people to read these articles and then read the study. But what this study says is that in counties that had disproportionately high casualties from these wars, those counties went for Trump. And what the study was able to show was basically that if you didn't have those casualties, you would not have had that. You wouldn't have had those counties going for Trump. And so in essence, you have these counties, primarily rural counties in Rust Belt states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, I think, were the ones that are named in there specifically, that where it was shown that, Trump wins in counties and then wins the presidency in these counties where you can make a connection to losses from the war. And then this is further substantiated by another study. And this is a really important one. I think this is something, my hopes with this presentation is that for those of us here in the anti-war community, this gives us ideas about how we take on the war machine, right? How we take on the empire, what are its weak points? Well, what works against it? What motivates people? What are the things that we can utilize to end these wars, the current ones and the future ones? And so there's a 2015 study that found that the higher local war deaths in terms of people in your community, in your county, who are killed in these wars, the higher the voter turnout's going to be. And then as a corollary, of course, less recent local war deaths equal lower turnout. And war brings less politically inclined voters to the polls. And one of the things, I think one of the findings in there that's so important for us is that first finding I put, that a conflict initially silences opposition, but as fatalities mount, the opposition is vitalized, which may lead to a higher turnout at the ballot box. Okay, so this study here, done ahead of the 2016 elections, is validated by what we see happen in these rural counties, with counties going for Trump, where quite possibly what this study is saying occurred, where local war deaths are going to increase voter turnout, is the case. And the reason being is that Clinton is tied to the Iraq War, not because she's a Secretary of State under Barack Obama, but because of her role in the Senate, because she's always been hawkish, et cetera, et cetera. So this effect, that how the war is actually played out politically, if we go back and look what Rove and his people were saying was going to happen, what you see that these wars have a tremendous political cost to both the Democrats and the Republicans, as well as a significant advantage for both Democrats and Republicans, depending upon how they utilize the wars for their political purpose and how the public feels about them. So I want to get into the media part of all this. So I think going into the war, going back 20 years, the GOP saw media coverage of the war as useful until casualties start occurring. And I think we see that in both the political results when we map those against casualty levels and media coverage. And so I think as we see casualties rise with a high degree of media coverage, you start to see real political cost coming from that. Democrats see that as well, and they use that not effectively in 2004, but in 06 and 08 they do. And the Pentagon going into these wars 20 years ago had taken an approach to the media where it had learned its lesson from Vietnam. And General David Petraeus, actually a good part of his PhD dissertation on the Vietnam War is about the American military's relationship with the press. And so what they want to do is they want to have a cooperative relationship rather than an adversarial relationship with the press. And they do things such as having journalist boot camps. And more importantly, they embed the journalists in with the troops. So these journalists are spending months and months and months with these young men and women, building relationships. So how are you going to go back and report negatively on when these young men and women, you're not just, in a survival situation in war, but you've also become their friends, right? So, but the other thing too is the access journalism. And the Pentagon is really ahead of everyone else in understanding how access journalism is going to work, particularly with the proliferation of media because of the internet, and this idea of a carrot and stick approach to media organizations and journalists, where if you're a good journalist, you can go on a helicopter ride around Iraq with General Petraeus. If you're a bad journalist, you're not going to get into any press briefings. We're not going to give you press credentials. You're never going to be able to go to these wars, because if you want to go to these wars on your own, go ahead, knock yourself out, but you're going to be kidnapped and they're going to cut your head off. So the Pentagon sees this opportunity to manipulate and control the media, because it also knows that the media understands war as good for ratings. And I think everyone's familiar with that, seeing how well the media did with its ratings, particularly in those months of 2003. What the media reality is, though, is that the Obama administration comes in and it looks at what happened to the Bush administration, and it looks at the political cost. It looked at how the public was motivated against the wars, right? It wasn't just that the public opinion was against the wars. It was that the people came out and voted against the wars and removed politicians from office who supported the wars or punished those who did. So what the Obama administration does coming into 2009 is it seeks to control the narrative and the public perception of the Afghan war. And it utilizes the Bush administration's tools, the access journalism and the embedding, but it also attempts to define the war and set expectations, right? So what it does, and again, Barack Obama is very smart about this. Him and his people are, they're going to surge and they're going to win using the things that we learned in Iraq, what the generals learned in Iraq and how successful the surge in Iraq was. We're going to use that in Afghanistan, but we're going to begin pulling the troops out by the summer of 2011. And then by 2013, we're going to turn the war over to the Afghans. And then we're going to end the war in 2014. And they're able to control that message. And that gets get out, and that helps both not in the 2010 midterms because they get crushed, but that's because of issues unrelated to the war. But it helps in 2012 when he runs for re-election. As we've seen, the war was a non-factor in that election. So go back and we're going to look at the public opinion for Afghanistan. So you go back to fall of 2001. Throughout, on a number of occasions, public opinion is over 90% for military action in Afghanistan. And in November of 2001, 71% of Americans support sending significant number of troops into Afghanistan. 8 years later, those numbers have dropped. And so when Barack Obama comes into office, only 47% of Americans support military action in Afghanistan. And in a year after Obama announces his surge at West Point, so that's December 2009. So by December of 2010, a year after Obama's been in office, or 2 years after he's been in office, 56% say the Afghan war is going badly. And public opinion never recovers, right? So by December 2013, the Afghan war becomes the most unpopular war in history. 82% of Americans, according to CNN, are opposed to the war. That's higher than the polling ever was for Iraq or for Vietnam. By August of 2021, you've seen, when the United States is forced to retreat and the Taliban win in Afghanistan, you're seeing nearly identical numbers of Americans saying Afghanistan and Iraq, they were not worth fighting. 62% for Afghanistan, 63% for Iraq. And from that period of time, from throughout that decade, those numbers mostly hold true. So you never see the Afghan war having a majority support in the United States unless you go back to the Bush administration. And by the time August 2021 comes around, 72% of Americans are saying get out. Even after you have that nightmare occur in Kabul, the horror of it all, 72% of Americans are still saying getting out was the right thing, whether it was handled correctly or not. What's the difference, though? Why was the Bush administration and the Republicans slaughtered for wars going badly and public opinion being against wars, and the Obama administration and the Trump administration not? And a lot of it comes down to media coverage. So I know this is going to be really hard for you all to see, but there's a guy named Andrew Tyndall, and he does fantastic work in terms of tracking media. And if you look, you'll see that in the first decade of this century, so first 10 years, among network nightly news coverage, so ABC, CBS, NBC, the U.S. wars accounted for 42% of their network nightly news coverage. So of the top 30 stories they reported on, 42% of that was devoted to the Iraq war or the Afghan war. The second decade, though, 2010 to 2019, when the Obama administration is in office and Trump administration is in office, the wars account for only 9% of network nightly news coverage. So what you see is this shift in media coverage, right? You go back to 2006 and 2007, and this is according to Pew. The Iraq war accounted for 22, or that should be read over 20% of U.S. media coverage. In 2007, it was 22% of U.S. media coverage. So you go back to then, and 1/5 of everything on American media is about the Iraq war. By 2010, that's dropped to 1%. So what you see is increased media coverage, though, of the Afghan war. However, that's done and conducted in line with the media and public relations campaigns of the White House and the Pentagon. And in discussion, I can give you some more details on that because I was involved with that quite a bit. But by 2011, you start seeing media coverage rapidly dropping of Afghanistan. So you see this spike in media attention in 2009 and 2010, well orchestrated, coincides with the surge in Afghanistan. But by 2011, that's rapidly dropping. And by 2014, you see things like the media stopped asking about Afghanistan in polls. So Pew doesn't ask a poll about Afghanistan from 2014 to 2018. The Washington Post doesn't ask a poll about Afghanistan for 7 years, basically, from December 2014 to August 2021. And this is all as the United States is spending $300 million a day. And the war is getting worse. It gets worse and worse. You can characterize it as a stalemate over those years, but it gets worse and worse. The Taliban gets stronger. They take more territory. The Afghan government becomes more predatory. The people suffer, and it worsens and it worsens. And the United States, even though we're not taking casualties, which is the important thing for the media coverage, we're spending $300 million a day. So here's a graph that shows you this NBC, CBS, and nightly news coverage of the Afghan war. And the important thing, if you look, right, you see that spike or very 2001, and then it drops, and then it plateaus. It spikes again in line with the Afghan surge under Obama. And then by 2011, it has dropped significantly. And then it continues to drop until it plateaus, until you reach the point that in 2020, ABC, CBS, and NBC devoted a combined 5 minutes of nightly news coverage to the war in Afghanistan. 5 minutes. I mean, so you really see how you compare this to the coverage of the Iraq war, and you could see how people here in the United States were being impacted by it, or not at all. Here's just the graph of CNN, Fox, MSNBC coverage of the war. again, starting with the Afghan surge, and you see it plateau until you get to the point where you're in the Trump administration, and there's almost no coverage of the Afghan war. And then finally, here's another example. This is all from Media Matters, where the Trump administration, during the Trump administration, so during those 4 years of Trump administration, the New York Times only covered the Afghan war 3 times a month in front page stories. And remember all the things that occurred, including the Afghan papers, right? That major revelation from the Washington Post that the war in Afghanistan, according to 600 American officials and military officers who were interviewed by the US government, said was a war built on lies, and it receives almost no coverage. So why does this shift in the media? And I think if you were to plot what we just saw, right, against, say, the troop presence numbers in Afghanistan, you'll see that as the numbers of troops drop, even though the violence doesn't drop, even though the fighting continues, gets worse, more and more people are killed, the Taliban are getting stronger, right? But as American forces drop, that media coverage drops. And that makes sense, right? I don't think anything here is really revelatory. I think it's just we have to really kind of put this into how do we put this into practice? How do we utilize this information? One of the things that's interesting, you'll see here, the red line is the American soldiers, and then the bars are the number of contractors. So you can see in 2011 as where contractors begin to equal number of troops, and then surpass them, and of course remain above that number for the remainder of the war. And then here is the same chart. This comes from the Congressional Research Service of American troop presence in Iraq from 2007 to 2020. One of the things I want you to notice here on these charts, because we're going to get into this in a second, is you'll see that in 2017, the Congressional Research Service is unable to find out how many American soldiers there are in Afghanistan. The Pentagon stopped saying how many soldiers are in Afghanistan. And there's barely any political cry. There's barely any media cry. And the same thing occurs even more in Iraq. You can see here as well. You see that little red comment there, exact troop numbers not known, right? Because one of the takeaways is to keep things hidden. Here's just a chart on the number of U.S. and NATO casualties in Afghanistan and Iraq. Again, you could chart that against media coverage and against political turnout, political reaction, and I think you would see some correlation there by month. Okay, so I think, what's the takeaway of all this? Well, I think if I'm the empire and I'm looking at it, I'm going to say wars can continue as long as they are unseen. So you can have, if you have high U.S. troop casualties with media coverage, you're going to have high political cost, right? Makes sense. Low U.S. troop casualties with media coverage, you're going to have political risk. And if you don't have any casualties, or if the casualties are hidden with very little media coverage, then there's no political risk, there's no cost, there's no consequence. And this is what the lessons learned that the Obama administration takes from the Bush administration, and what the Trump administration takes and really perfects. In particular, Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense under Trump, and John Kelly, Trump's chief of staff, both of whom were 4-star Marine Corps generals, they really understood this, and they perfected it in a way that the Biden administration, I believe, is continuing to utilize. So what does this evolution look like? What does it mean on the ground for these wars? When you look at the political costs, you look at how the media reacts, and how the media influences the public, and how the public then is involved politically. Well, I think the first thing is the White Houses say, minimize U.S. casualties, keep them on the bases, don't allow them out into combat, use them as trainers. And you see that in both Iraq and Afghanistan, right? And I think with that, by one of the first things they do, say starting around 2010 in Iraq, really 2009 in Iraq, and in 2011 in Afghanistan, is to keep the U.S. forces on the bases. Let the Afghans go out and get killed. No one's going to report on that, right? So you start to see casualty numbers drop very quickly, okay? And that takes away the attention. That takes away the media's concern or the media's interest. And then the next thing they do is they make the war secret, Okay, so this is where, I mean, we were talking before about how, go back 20 years, they wanted these wars to be public. They wanted them to be spectacle. They wanted them to be something that people could watch as they're eating dinner, right, on their television screens. And that is the blowback from that, of course, is catastrophic politically for the Bush administration. So what the Obama administration says, and then of course the Trump administration and the Biden administration pick up on, is we got to make these wars secret, make them special operations and CIA wars, so that nobody is aware what's going on. These are officially classified operations. So White House, Pentagon, State Department spokespeople aren't even allowed to talk about them. They couldn't tell you anything if they wanted to, because these are secret wars. And the same thing, use drones, because everything involved with the drones is secret. Everything is classified. So anything that a drone does is classified. It takes off, it flies in a circle and lands. That's classified. Nobody's supposed to be talking about that as far as the American government is concerned, right? So you make these wars secret, you classify them, and you don't just classify the operations, but you classify the information, right? So I think the example I want to share is you go back to when Leon Panetta was Secretary of Defense, and he starts classifying things in 2012, 2013, and preventing media from getting it, as well as the Special Inspector General for Afghan Reconstruction. And so what you see, if you're following the wars and the information the Pentagon is putting out, is that every couple of months, something else becomes classified. And you can no longer really get a feel for the progress of the war, because things that were available publicly a couple of months ago are no longer available. And, you know, the Trump administration takes that even further. I mean, one of the things the Pentagon used to do was they used to tell you every month how many bombs they would drop someplace. You know, CENTCOM would drop 5,621 bombs on Syria in May. They were happy in their vainglory. They were happy. They were proud of this, right? And then as the Obama administration matures, and then as the Trump administration comes in, a lot of that information is cut off, keeping the war secret. And then, of course, you have, you're keeping it secret not just from the media and the public, but from the Congress. So you can have, as what happened in, say, 2017, when I believe it was 4 American Green Berets were killed in Niger, and nobody knew they were in Niger. And it wasn't as if the United States had just had like a single A team of 12 guys there. They had about 1,000 troops in Niger. Lindsey Graham, who is about the most hawkish person you can find on Capitol Hill, who, if anybody the Pentagon would share information with, would be Lindsey Graham. He didn't even know that the Pentagon had soldiers in Niger, let alone that they were engaging in combat. So you can see how this is a benefit, how they could now run wars, again, from the west coast of Africa all the way to Pakistan without anyone knowing. And if no one knows, no one cares. Next thing is you're going to utilize contractors. That keeps the casualties hitting. I think most people know that 7,000 American soldiers were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan. Most people don't know that 8,000 contractors were killed in those wars. So the actual number of U.S. casualties in the Iraq and Afghan war in terms of dead were 15,000, because those contractors were all doing jobs that in previous wars would have been done by someone in uniform. Okay. And then contractors, you can avoid accountability, you avoid oversight, you avoid control by Congress, the media, the public. If you want information from a contractor, from a weapons company, from Beltway Bandit, you have to try and subpoena them in federal court. That's not going to go over. With the American government, at least you can try and do a FOIA request. And what you see, and a good example too, is with the accountability, it lets the American government get away with things it might not be able to get away with otherwise. Now, the American government's got away with torture, but in the case of, say, CACI, which is a consulting firm and does a lot of work for the Department of Defense and the NSA and the CIA, the American government used CACI contractors to torture Iraqis. And when the families of those people tried to sue CACI in American court, the American court said, well, this happened in Iraq, and Iraq's a sovereign country, and the American courts have no jurisdiction. So you can have an American company at the behest under contract from the American government go and torture people in Iraq, and there could be no accountability for it, right? And then as well, contractors, it fits into the whole outsourcing and privatization of the military and government that's been going on, since the Nixon administration, the Carter administration, that Clinton really jumped on, that Rumsfeld loved, et cetera. So it fits into the overall scheme. And then you're going to use proxies, whether it's government or militia proxies, I should say, or and they're going to be sectarian. That fits into your divide and conquer strategy. Oftentimes, maybe it's the continuation of already long-running conflicts, and it hides costs because nobody, again, being facetious here, but who cares if the Iraqis are killing the Iraqis, if the Afghans are killing Afghans? Half the time you say something about it, people in DC about that and say, oh, those people have been killing each other for thousands of years. I think everyone knows that response I'm talking about, which is really pretty disgusting and despicable. And then finally, what you get here is with this evolution by the White House and the Pentagon is you get a resetting of roles and adversaries for the Pentagon, right? Where the special operations and CIA guys, they get their secret wars, okay, including that world war in the Muslim world, right? And this allows special operations and CIA personnel to fight wars their entire career. Those wars are never going to end. They're not meant to end. There's no way they could end. The only way they're going to end is if the American government stops bankrolling them. We're not seeing that happen anytime soon. So those wars continue, and that allows for special operations and CIA officers to have wars throughout their entire career. And for those guys, you can't imagine something like that. Imagine something you're passionate about and being able to do it for life, right? The Army gets to focus on Russia. You can't justify adding a couple of brigades of tanks and armored vehicles to your army if you don't have an adversary like Russia. The same thing with the Navy. They get to focus on China. You don't get to justify $15 billion aircraft carriers without an adversary like the Chinese. And the Air Force, they can focus on both Russia and China, and that's how they justify purchasing 100 B-21 bombers for $200 billion. So it's going to work out to about $2 billion per plane. Right? Without those adversaries, those things aren't justifiable. And the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, with the exception of, say, Petraeus and McChrystal and some others, they were not the wars the services wanted. These are men and women who want to become the next Eisenhower, who want to be the next Nimitz, who want to be the next Hap Arnold, and they don't want to be bogged down in these wars in Afghanistan and Iraq that really burdened the services. It sucked up their resources, sucked up their manpower. The Army, if you talk to guys in the Army, they'll tell you they have artillery officers who've never fired their cannons because they were in Afghanistan and Iraq their entire time, right? So, it was burdensome for them. It's not what they wanted. And it doesn't fit into the intent or the fantasy or the desire of either the individuals or the institutions. But give the Army Russia, give the Navy Chinese, tell the Air Force they can have both. And now they have wars and adversaries that they want. I'm going to skip over Ukraine and just go to a summary here because this has taken longer than I expected. I appreciate everyone listening. So the anti-war movement had a profound effect on the U.S. in its wars. It wasn't the effect that we wanted or intended, but it makes sense though. What we're up against is a living organism. It's not, there's no reason to think that the Pentagon and the White House that they would have stayed static, that they wouldn't have evolved, that they wouldn't have reacted and done things differently, seeing how the Bush administration got hurt by these wars. Well, if the opportunity is to end the war or to just change how you're going to do the war and keep the war going, what do you think these guys are going to do, right? So I think for us, understanding how these successive White Houses and the Pentagon, how they understood, accepted, they evolved to the political cost of the war. They understood how the media actually was going to affect American public perception as well as American political involvement. Because again, as we see, you can have these wars that are wildly popular, but if people don't feel affected by them, whether it's physically because people in their communities are being killed or emotionally because they're seeing it on television, then you can have 70% disapproval of these wars, and these wars can keep going because we saw that happen with Afghanistan for years. Again, $300 million a day, 60 to 80% disapproval ratings for that war, and the war kept going until the Taliban decided they had enough and they won. So these are all opportunities, I think, looking back for us to look forward and say, how do we better oppose current and future wars? So I'm going to end it there. That took much longer than I thought it was going to take. I apologize for that, but I appreciate everyone sitting through that. And if people have questions, I'm really happy to talk about this. And and there's much more I can go into on this as well on specific things.
Well, thank you, Matthew. That was really amazing. Some people are clapping. I don't know if you can see that. I'm going to go back to the beginning of a long list of questions, and we will go this was scheduled for an hour. but that was worth it, and we'll just go a few minutes over. So Vince asked, shouldn't the lessons of the Iraq War be to oppose all wars of aggression? And I think we can all agree with the spirit of that. But before I ask you that, Vince also asked a more probing question, I think. How do you and how do we find the balance between criticizing Russia for a war of aggression and criticizing, the U.S. imperialist war machine that obviously has been playing a role as well? How do you find the balance? And I think in our questions, Vince and others have been discussing this actually during the last few minutes. So how do you find that balance?
Yeah, it's the war that the Ukraine war is a war that many in DC have wanted for many years, going back decades. It's a war that many in Moscow have wanted for going back decades. It is a war with no good sides. The only side worth supporting are the people. It's a war that I view as a war that is dominated by fossil fuel interests and commerce and other trade aspects, and by megalomania. I think finding the balance is hard to talk about it publicly in the United States, because one, and I didn't talk about Ukraine, because what I kind of saw Ukraine as, or I kind of see Ukraine as, is really a perfection of this evolving White House and Pentagon war-making ability, where they were able to construct this war in Ukraine with Russia as a willing co-partner in this. But they were able to construct this war in Ukraine that meets all this criteria for how do you wage war in this modern era as the empire without having political blowback. And so I think what you have is you have this construction within the Iraq of the Ukraine war, where you have a number of things that help ameliorate or help downplay some of the things I was bringing up. I want to go back to that slide. One of the things is that you just have an easily controlled narrative against the war. In the United States, we have this real problem with everything has to be A versus B, black versus white. And so if you can construct a war that has a very Manichaean narrative of good versus evil, and you're able to have a very clear villain, such as Vladimir Putin. This gets back to kind of, you talk to some people about the Libyan Syrian wars and the understanding of the American government and how they were involved in those wars. And what you see is, you see, of course, in the Libyan war, a clear and decisive operation by the United States and NATO to kill Gaddafi, to take out the leader of Libya. You never really see that in Syria. And one of the reasons why I suspect is because you want to have that villain in place. You want to have someone that you're up against. You want to have someone who our narrative is very clear on. The United States goes into Iraq, it takes out Saddam Hussein, we find him in a hole 8 months later, and then who's the bad guy from then on, right? I mean, it's very hard to justify a war if you don't have that Hitler-like figure. And so I think that's something that the United States has in the Ukraine war. And I certainly see the Ukraine war as a full proxy war. And, but it is, I think the thing for us to be is to be very assertive and to be very clear that I don't support the oligarchs who support the American war in Ukraine. And I don't support the oligarchs that support the Russian war in Ukraine. And I think we just have to be very definitive in that and very clear. And we have to go back to what our predecessors 100 years or more than 100 years ago were saying about the First World War, that this is a war that has got no good sides in it, that this is a war between oligarchs. In that case, it's a war between colonizing monarchs, right? So I think we just have to explain who we are, what we want to see, and how we fit into this conversation, so that it's different than the other voices that dominate the conversation.
Thanks, Matt. Okay, Larry Berman asks, are you suggesting that the US media is the one who promotes war? If so, what can we do to prevent this?
I think they do. There certainly are aspects of the US media that benefit from war. And it's very good for ratings. It's very good for clicks. Certainly we can get into a whole other discussion on how the U.S. media structure, the corporate structure fits into the overall corporate structure in the United States, how all these entities are tied together, how Exxon is tied to State Street, which is tied to Disney, which then ties you to ABC and George Stephanopoulos, right? And then, of course, throw the Department of Defense in there as Exxon's biggest fuel purchaser, right? I mean, so we can get in those higher level kind of conversations about how does this all work in terms of what decisions are made at the board level. And because that's certainly, you have to go back and you have to look and see, NBC is such a great example of this. What occurred at NBC in the Iraq War? In the fact that people like Ashley Banfield, Phil Donahue, Jesse Ventura were all fired for their opinions on the Iraq War. And then as you know, you had, as more complicity occurred with, say, the Obama administration, you saw journalists like Dylan Ratigan and Cenk Uygur and Crystal Ball and others depart MSNBC under other aspects of that this is a politicized process, that the news is controlled by individuals who have their own interests at stake. And that they represent other institutions. So the fact that war is good for the media is understandable. And we also saw, like I said, with the ratings. One of the things I think that made these wars difficult, and what you see is different on the Ukraine side, is that the American media has a very willing in Ukraine to go along with what the Ukrainian narrative is, to go along with the Ukrainian view of the war, and to embed themselves or take advantage of the Ukrainian army's hospitality. You had what you had happen in the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan was the same. And there was such a gatekeeping and such a kind of access journalism where if you are not going to report the way we want you to report, you won't be allowed back next time. So that has proven very effective. And the Ukraine war, certainly there are a number of things out there that speak to how the Ukraine war has received more attention from the media than either the Iraq or the Afghan wars ever did. So there's a lot to the media's culpability and complicity in all of this. And certainly I think their ratings-based structure is part of it. I think their connection to other institutions is also part of it. They also share the same cocktail circuit. They're all friends. So there is a great thing that came out a few years ago, is the guest list for Katharine Graham's Christmas party in Long Island a number of years ago. And the list of people who, were together at this party, it's just like George Carlin says, right? Or George Carlin used to say, it's a big club and you ain't in it. And you could see the members of this club, and the fact that these generals are all friends with the bankers, and the bankers are all friends with the presidents of the news media, on and on and on. You understand these relationships.
I'd like to stick with the topic of media, which is, I think, the main thing you're bringing to us today. And I do think we'll have time to touch upon all of these questions. I don't know if we'll have time to go deep into each of them, but sticking with the question of media, and this is my own question, do you think progressive movements can build their own media centers that compete with this, obviously corrupt and useless, mainstream commercially supported corporate media?
I mean, the elephant in the room, of course, is the money. How do you have the money to build the networks and the infrastructure to distribute, et cetera, et cetera. But put that aside, what gives me hope for it, though, is what we're doing here right now, this type of technology. 5 years ago, we were doing things like this, but it wasn't always that great. 10 years ago, we were certainly not doing things like this. When I first started doing media in 2009, so 13 years ago, really up through at least 2014, at least, you were doing everything in a studio, and really 2018, I was going into studios still, this ability for us to do this. So having this technology, this ability to communicate, to inform, to coordinate, to mobilize, to educate, all these different things that this technology allows us to do, I don't think we really understand it yet. And we certainly don't know where it can go and what we can do with it. I think we have to, just as we understand, look, the U.S. war machine was going to evolve to these wars. It's not going to stay stasis. It's static. It's a living organism. We have to do the same in terms of the media. that, and you could see this. So a number of years ago, I used to watch, all my leftist YouTube shows. I watched Lee Camp and I watched Richard Wolff and stuff like that on YouTube. And a number, and then when Lee Camp was over, it would recommend that I watch, I don't know who, Brianna Joy Gray next or someone like that, right? And then but then after a while, that stopped. And so, I'd be watching, again, Lee Camp, and then YouTube would start recommending Sean Hannity for me or Rachel Maddow, right? I mean, because the networks, they saw how YouTube was performing. They saw the people going to YouTube and watching programs this way. So they said to YouTube, we need to be in on this. Here's money, change your algorithm. And that's how you can go and you can watch, someone like, you can watch, someone like Aaron Mate or Max Blumenthal. And the next thing you get is Tucker Carlson or, Joyanne Reed or somebody like that.
Because hate speech sells. I'm going to ask two questions by Al Mitty. One of them is very broad and the other is more specific. I noticed you asked both of them, Al. And feel free you could ask yourself, but I'll start. He says, if you were the commander in peace, how would you guide the US? And then he also asks, does a Chinese-led alliance with Brazil, India, South Africa, Russia, and maybe others such as North Korea and Iran set the stage for the ultimate war, NATO versus the rest? So that's two big questions, Al. Go ahead.
That's the Thucydides trap, right? An emerging empire is threatened by, or a dominant empire is threatened by the emerging empire. So war results, and ends up destroying the empire, on and on. I mean, that's something that goes back 3,000 years or so, I guess, or however many. And so I think that's certainly where you see with the fears of the American empire that it's going to be overtaken. And it has in many ways, particularly financially and economically. And there's a fear that, monetarily, things will, the American empire will be displaced and that will lose its reserve currency status, which would, cause all kinds of problems. But yeah, this notion that setting the stage for the ultimate war, NATO. What I will say about that, I would amend, Al, your question to say set the stage for the ultimate and final war, because if there was such a war, that would be the final war. The idea that you could have a war like that, and I'm in the camp of people who believe that the Americans, the United States would be would likely be the first to use nuclear weapons in a war. That once you have that escalation, that there would be no de-escalation, and you can't. Escalation's like a ladder, right? You can either go up or you can go down, and that would be the end of the world. That would be the end of our civilization. So I think it's incumbent upon us to do everything to present alternatives to such a possibility. But that's certainly where we're heading, and we've been heading that way with the Chinese for close to 30 years now. This idea that we're going to sail our aircraft carriers up to their coastlines starting in the mid-90s or so, humiliate them, and that they weren't going to push back, or that when they said, if you keep doing this, we're going to be forced to respond. And if they say, if you build a new generation of nuclear weapons, we're going to have to modernize and increase our own nuclear arsenal, which they're doing. The Chinese for decades had only 300 nuclear weapons or so. That's all they felt they needed. And now, because of the next generation of American nuclear weapons that have come on board, the Chinese are increasing that to between 1,000 and 2,000 nuclear weapons, and modernizing them themselves. So what happens is we create a reality of our own making, and the Ukraine war is a great example of that, right? We create this reality where we keep pushing until there's a response. And then we hope that then this response, this invasion of Ukraine by Russia, it fills into there's a guy named C. Wright Mills who wrote in the 50s. He was one of the first political scientists, philosophers to take on the Cold War. And he called the men, they were all men basically in power. He called them crackpot realists. And that's what we have here. We have crackpot realists. The idea that somehow we're going to induce, we're going to push, we're going to bully Russia into invading Ukraine. They do it. And then that's going to bring about Russia's downfall, because this is just going to be the way it worked in Afghanistan, and on and on and on. We're going to give Russia its own Iraq war. So, and that this is going to cause Vladimir Putin to fall. I mean, this is the stuff of the crackpot realists. And so, yeah, this fantasizing, whether it be individually or institutionally, about some type of war against this emerging bloc of nations is something that you will hear spoken about all throughout DC, in London, in Brussels. It's incredibly dangerous. And I think our biggest concern is not falling in the trap of going with the binary discussion of us versus them, of the US and NATO versus the BRIC countries, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China. It is about, okay, what's the third way? Okay, we have to go back again 100 some odd years to our internationalist colleagues, Eugene Debs and Emma Goldman and them, right? And certainly our libertarian friends can go back to their side as well. And reaching out and understanding that we have to find other ways rather than this binary construct, because that binary construct always leads to adversaries banging against each other until you have war.
Well, I want to thank you for being here, Matthew. I want to ask Larry or Al if they have any final words, but thank you so much.
The thing with all of this, it always seems to boil down to profit, and the human factor is completely not considered. There's a Colonel Nguyen Doi, Vietnamese colonel, who said that in every war, it mattered not who won or lost, the people always lose. And that's what we see with wars, is the men, women, and children who suffer so that profit and power can come from war. And Matt, I certainly want to thank you for your outstanding presentation here. And so I will let it go at that. And I thank you, and I thank you, Mark. And I'll pass it on to Al for any final comments.
Oh, thanks, Larry. The Matthew, you ended on that question that I had raised about the ultimate war or whatever. The hope, as you've described, the hope, and I've seen in the chat, is that we need to abolish all war. And those are things, that's something humankind can do. That's something Dr. King told us we either need to do or we will not survive. That's something Pope Francis tells us. That's where I get hope at, especially at this time of the year, that folks, we could do this if we want to do this, and we have to end all wars.
Yeah, and there's such a madness to it. We have, and the Russians have them as well, and the Chinese do as well. And one of the things Larry Wilkerson will talk about is Larry will talk about how because of us, the Chinese now have their own military-industrial complex, and they are facing the same pressures that we face from it. I mean, this is, and certainly you could see that with the Russians as well. You see that with the Indians. You see how the Saudis are starting to act. The Israelis, of course, their weapons industry is second to none. And they have a whole captive, they have millions of people captive that they can experiment their weapons on as well. So they're even a class above, most nations. But, if I go back to what I was saying before, and I'm sorry if I felt like I rushed through it because the beginning of the presentation took so long, but this division of the world to the various services, and the armed services getting what they want, the Army getting Russia. What you have is within the American military, and then certainly within civilian defense circles within Washington, D.C., within London, again in Moscow and Beijing, this idea that they can do better than previous generations, that where previous generations failed, they can do better, and that they are building or they're evolving, and that they are now in the 5th generation of warfare, and they want to go down in history as being that the person who really solidified their role, really solidified their place in history that way. But you see this with conversations going back to the nuclear weapons, and again, there are those in the U.S. and there are those in London and there are those in Beijing and Moscow who say this as well, that we have usable nuclear weapons, that it's just a degree of doing it better than before, that we now have technology that allows us to use nuclear weapons in a way that in the 60s or 70s would not have been possible. And yet they forget that both NATO and the Warsaw Pact had plans to use nuclear weapons in their war making. They each had plans to use them. So they think they're the first to stumble upon this idea of usable nuclear weapons, and of course the folly of that, the danger of that, and the way that this is all played with is really, really incredibly dangerous. I'll be interested to see next month, when the Federation of American Scientists, what it does with its doomsday clock. I can't imagine it's going to go back. I can only imagine it's going to go forward.
Well, I think we're going to have to close with that. We're several minutes over. Thank you again, Matthew. And thank you, Larry and Al, Greta, and everybody